and Nynaeve. They shared it, as I recall. Egwene gave a start. She'd been careless. It's the same. A remembrance gift when they left. Twisting the silver circlet around her wrist, she felt a stab of guilt that was all her own. The bracelet appeared segmented, but so cunningly you could not see how exactly. She had hardly thought of Nynaeve and Elaine since their departure for Ebu Dar. Perhaps she should call them back. Their search was not going well, it seemed, though they denied it. Still, if they could find what they were after. Shiriam was frowning. Whether or not of the bracelet, Egwene could not say. She could not allow Shiriam to start thinking too much on that bracelet, though. If she ever noticed that the necklace Marigan wore was a match, there might be painfully awkward questions. Rising, Egwene smoothed her skirt as she moved around the table. Swan had acquired several pieces of information today. One could be put to good use now. She was not the only one with secrets. Shiriam looked surprised when she stopped too close for the other woman to stand. Daughter, I've learned that a few days after Swan and Lyanna arrived in Salidar, 10 sisters left. 2 from each Ajah there, except the blue. Where did they go, and why? Shiriam's eyes narrowed a fraction, but she wore serenity as comfortably as her dress. Mother, I can hardly recall No dancing around, Shiriam. Egwene moved a little closer, until their knees almost touched. No lies by omission. The truth. A frown creased Shiriam's smooth forehead. Mother, even if I knew, you cannot trouble yourself with every little... The truth, Shiriam. The whole truth. Must I ask before the entire hall why I cannot have the truth from my keeper? I will have it, daughter, one way or another. I will have it. Shiriam's head swiveled as though she was looking for a way to escape. Her eyes fell on Chesa, hunched over her sewing, and she all but gasped with relief. Mother, tomorrow, when we are alone, I am sure I can explain everything to your satisfaction. I must speak with a few of the sisters first, so they could work up what Shiriam was to tell her tomorrow. Chesa, Egwene said, wait outside, please. For all that she seemed focused on her work to the exclusion of everything else, Chesa bounded to her feet in a flash and very nearly ran from the tent. When Aes Sedai were at odds, anyone with half a brain went elsewhere. Now, daughter, Egwene said, the truth, all that you know. This is as private as you will be, she added, when Shiriam glanced at Swan. For a moment, Shiriam adjusted her skirts, plucking at them really, avoiding Egwene's eyes, no doubt still working out evasions. But the 3 oaths trapped her. She could not speak an untrue word, and whatever she thought of Egwene's true position, slipping behind her back was a long way from denying her authority to her face. Even Romanda maintained the proper courtesies, if only by a hair at times. Drawing a deep breath, Shiriam folded her hands in her lap and spoke to Egwene. Matter of fact. When we learned the Red Ajah was responsible for setting Logain up as a false dragon, we felt something had to get done. We certainly meant the small coterie of sisters she had gathered around her. Carlinia and Baonin and the rest held as much real sway as most sitters, if not actually in the hall. Elida was sending out demands for every sister to return to the tower, so we chose 10 sisters to do just that, by the fastest means they could manage. They all should be there long since, quietly making sure that every sister in the tower understands the truth of what the Reds did with Logain. Not... She hesitated, then finished in a rush. Not even the hall knows of them. Egwene stepped away, rubbing her temples again, quietly making sure, in the hope that Elida would be deposed. Not exactly a bad scheme, really. It might even work eventually. It might take years, too. But then for most sisters, the longer they could go without truly doing anything, the better. With enough time, they could convince the world that the White Tower had never really broken. It had been broken before, even if only a handful knew it. Maybe with enough time, they could find a way to adjust everything so it had not, really. Why keep it from the hall, Shiriam? Surely you don't think any of them would betray your plan to Elida? Half the sisters eyed the other half askance for fear of Elida's sympathizers, partly for fear of that. Mother, a sister who decided that what we do is a mistake would hardly let herself be chosen a sitter. Any such would have taken herself away long since. Shiriam had not relaxed, but her voice took on the patient, instructing tone she seemed to think had the greatest effect on Egwene. Usually, though, she was more adroit at changing the subject. These suspicions are the worst problem we face for the time being. No one really trusts anyone. If we could only see how to... The Black Ajah. Swan cut in quietly. That's what chills your blood like a silver pike up your skirts. Who can say for sure who is black? And who can say what a black sister might do? Shiriam darted another hard look at Swan, but after a moment the force went out of her. Or rather, one sort of tension replaced another. She glanced at Egwene, then nodded reluctantly. By the sour twist to her mouth, she would have made another evasion had it not been plain Egwene would not stand for it. Most sisters in the camp believed now, but after more than 3,000 years denying the Black Ajah's existence, it was a queasy belief. Almost no one would open her mouth on that topic, no matter what they believed. The question, Mother, Swan went on, is what happens when the Hall does find out. She seemed to be thinking aloud again. I can't see any sitter accepting the excuse that she couldn't be told because she might be on Elijah's side. And as for the possibility she might be Black Ajah, yes, I think they will be quite upset. Shiriam's face paled slightly. It was a wonder she did not go dead white. Upset did not begin to cover it. Yes, Shiriam would face much more than upset if this came out. Now was the time to drive home her advantage, but another question occurred to Egwene. If Shiriam and her friends had sent... what were they? Not spies. Ferrets, maybe, sent into the walls after rats. If Shiriam had sent ferrets into the White Tower, could... A sudden stab of pain through that pocket of sensations in the back of her head sent everything else flying. Had she felt it directly, it would have been numbing. As it was, her eyes bulged in shock. A man who could channel was touching the necklace around Moghedien's neck. This was one link no man could be brought up to. Pain, and something unheard of from Moghedien. And then it was all gone. The awareness, the emotions. The necklace was off. I need some fresh air, she managed. Shiriam started to rise, and Swan, but she waved them back down. No, I want to be alone, she said hastily. Swan, find out everything Shiriam knows about the ferrets. Light, I meant the 10 sisters. They both stared at her, but thanks to Light, neither followed as she snatched the lantern from its hook and hurried out. It would not do for the Amerlin to be seen running, yet she came close, hoisting her divided skirts as well as she could with her free hand, and very nearly trotting. A cloudless sky made the moonlight bright, dappling the tents and wagons with shadows. Most people in the camp were asleep, but low fires still burned here and there. A handful of warders were about, a few servants, too many eyes to see if she ran. The last thing she wanted was someone offering help. She realized she was panting, but from alarm, not exertion. Thrusting her head and the lantern into Marigan's tiny tent, she found it empty. The blankets that made up the pallet on the ground lay in a sprawl, tossed aside by someone in a hurry. And what if she had still been here, she wondered, with the necklace off, and maybe whoever freed her. Shivering, she withdrew slowly. Moghedien had good reason to dislike her very personally, and the only sister who could match one of the Forsaken alone when she could channel at all was in Ebou Dar. Moghedien could have killed Egwene without anyone noticing. Even had a sister felt her channel, there would be nothing remarkable in that. Worse, Moghedien might not have killed her, and no one noticed anything until they found the pair of them gone. Mother, Chesa fussed behind her, you should not be out in the night air. Night air is bad air. If you wanted Marigan, I could have fetched her. Egwene very nearly jumped. She had not been aware of Chesa following her. She studied the people at the nearest fires. They had gathered for companionship, not warmth in this unholy heat, and they were not close. Maybe someone had seen who went into Marigan's tent. She certainly had few visitors, and no men among them. A man might well have been remarked. I think she has run away, Chesa. Why, that wicked woman, Chesa exclaimed. I always said she had a mean air and a sneaking eye, slinking away like a thief after you took her in. She'd be starving by a road if not for you. No gratitude at all. She followed all the way back to the tent where Egwene slept, nattering on about wickedness in general, the thanklessness of Marigan in particular, and how that sort should be handled, which seemed to jump between switching them till they settled down and tossing them out before they could run away, tucked around cautions that Egwene check her jewelry to be sure it was all still there. Egwene barely heard. Her mind spun. It could not have been Loghain, could it? He could not have known about Moghedien, much less come back to rescue her. Could he? Those men Rand was gathering, those Ashaman. Rumor in every village carried whispers of Ashaman and the Black Tower. Most of the sisters tried to pretend they were unaffected by dozens of men who could channel gathering in one spot. The worst of the tales had to be inflated. Rumor always exaggerated. But Egwene's toes wanted to curl under with fright whenever she thought of them. And Ashaman could have... How would he have known any more than Loghain? She was trying to avoid the only reasonable conclusion. Something far worse than Loghain had come back, or even Ashaman. One of the Forsaken had freed Moghedien. Ravine was dead by Rand's hand, according to Nynaeve, and he had killed Ishamael as well, or so it seemed. And Aginor and Balthamel. Moiraine had killed Be'lal. That left only Asmodean, Demandred, and Samael among the men. Samael was in Ilion. No one knew where the others were, or any of the women who survived. Moiraine had done for Lanfear too, or they had done for each other. But all the other women were still alive, so far as anyone knew. Forget the women. It had been a man. Which? Plans had been laid long since in case one of the Forsaken struck at the camp. No one sister here could equal any of the Forsaken by herself, but linked in circles was another matter, and any Forsaken who stepped into their camp would find circles forming on every side of him, or her, once they realized who she was. The Forsaken showed no signs of agelessness for some reason. Maybe it was some effect of being connected to the Dark One. This was dithering. She had to start thinking clearly. Chesa? Looked like you need your head rubbed for the ache again, is what you... Yes, Mother? Find Swan and Lyanna. Tell them to come to me, but don't let anyone hear you. Grinning, Chesa dropped a curtsy and scampered out. She could hardly avoid knowing the currents that swirled around Egwene, yet she found all the plotting and scheming fun. Not that she knew more than the surface, and little enough of that. Egwene did not doubt her loyalty. Change if she channeling the oil lamps and Egwene blew out the lantern in a corner. Maybe she had to think clearly, but she still felt as if she was stumbling in the dark. Chapter 9. A pair of silver pipes. Egwene was one of the few real children with a little plain carving like a farmer's best armchair, roomy and comfortable enough that she felt no touch of guilt about taking up valuable space for it. She was sitting there trying to pull her thoughts together when Swan swept it and ducked into the tent. Swan was not happy. Why in the light did you run off? Her voice had not changed with her face, and she chided with the best even when she did it in respectful tones. Barely respectful. Her blue eyes remained the same, too. They could have done for a saddle maker's awls. Shiriam brushed me aside like a fly. That surprisingly delicate mouth twisted. She was gone almost as soon as you were. Don't you realize she handed herself to you? She certainly does. Her and Anaya and Morbryn and a lot of them. You can be sure they'll spend tonight trying to bail water and patch holes. They could manage it. I don't see how, but they might. Almost as the last word left her mouth, Lyanna entered. A tall, willowy woman, her coppery face was as youthful as Swan's, and for the same reason. She also was more than old enough to be Egwene's mother, in truth. Lyanna took one look at Swan and threw up her hands as much as the roof of the tent would allow. Mother, this is a foolish risk. Her dark eyes went from dreamy to flashing, but her voice had a languorous quality even when she was irritated. Once it had been brisk. If anyone sees Swan and me together this way, I don't care if the whole camp learns your squabbling is a fraud. Egwene broke in sharply, weaving a small barrier against eavesdropping around the three of them. It could be worked through with time, but not without detection, so long as she held the weave instead of tying it off. She did care, and perhaps she should not have called them both, but her first half-coherent thought had been to summon the two sisters she could count on. No one in the camp so much as suspected. Everyone knew the former Amerlin and her former keeper detested one another every bit as much as Swan detested being tutor to her successor. Should any sister uncover the truth, they might well find themselves doing penance for a long time to come, and not an easy one. Aes Sedai appreciated being made fools of even less than other people. Kings had been made to pay for that. But in the meanwhile, their supposed animosity resulted in a certain leverage with the other sisters, including sisters. If they both said the same thing, it must be so. Another incidental effect of being stilled was very useful, one no one else knew about. The three oaths no longer held them. They could lie like wool merchants now. Schemes and deceptions on every side. The camp was like some fetid swamp where strange roads sprouted unseen in mists. Maybe anywhere Aes Sedai gathered was like that. After 3,000 years of plotting, however necessary, it was hardly surprising that scheming had become second nature to most sisters, and only a breath away for the rest. The truly horrible thing was that she found herself beginning to enjoy all the machinations, not for their own sake, but as puzzles. They made twisted bits of iron could intrigue her a quarter so much. What that said about her she did not want to know. Well, she was Aes Sedai, whatever anyone thought, and she had to take the bad of it with the good. Moghedien has escaped, she went on without pause. A man removed the Idam from her, a man who can channel. I think one of them took the necklace away. It wasn't in her tent, that I saw. There might be some way to find it using the bracelet, but if there is, I don't know it. That took the starch right out of them. Lyanna's legs gave way, and she dropped like a sack onto the stool Chaser sometimes used. Swan sat down on the cot slowly, back very straight, hands very still on her knees. Incongruously, Egwene noticed that her dress had tiny blue flowers embroidered in a wide Tyran maze around the bottom, a band that made the divided skirt seem one when she was still. Another band curved becomingly across the bodice. Concern for her clothes, that they be pretty instead of just suitable, was certainly a small change, looking at it one way. She never took it to extremes. Yet in another it was as drastic as her face, and a puzzle. Swan resented the changes and resisted them, except for this one. Lyanna, on the other hand, in true Aes Sedai fashion, embraced what had changed. A young woman again. Egwene had overheard a Yellow exclaiming in wonder that both were prime childbearing age by everything she could find. She might never have been keeper, never have had any other face. The very image of practicality and efficiency became the ideal of an indolent and alluring Damani woman. Even her riding dress was cut in the style of her native land, and no matter that its silk, so thin it barely seemed opaque, was as impractical as the pale green color for traveling dusty roads. Told that having been stilled had broken all ties and associations, Lyanna had chosen the green Aja over a return to the blue. Changing Ajas was not done, but then no one had been stilled and then healed before either. Swan had gone right back into the blue, grumbling over the idiotic need to entreat and appeal for acceptance, as the formal phrase went. "Oh, light," Lyanna breathed, as she thumped onto the stool with considerably less than her usual grace. "We should have turned her over for trial the first day. Nothing we've learned from her is worth letting her loose on the world again. Nothing." It was a measure of her shock. She did not normally go about stating the obvious. Her brain had not grown indolent, whatever her outward demeanor. Languid and seductive Damani women might be on the outside, but they were still known as the sharpest traders anywhere. Bloody, we should have had her watched," Swan growled through her teeth. Egwene's eyebrows rose. Swan must be as shaken as Lyanna. By who, Swan? Faolain? Theodrin? They don't even know you two are of my party. A party, 5 women. And Faolain and Theodrin were hardly eager, especially Faolain. Nynaeve and Elaine could be counted too, of course, and Birgitte certainly, even if she was not Aes Sedai. But they were a long way off. Stealth and cunning were still her major strengths, plus the fact that no one expected them of her. How should I have explained to anyone why they were supposed to watch my serving woman? For that matter, what good would it have done? It had to be one of the Forsaken. Do you really think Faolain and Theodrin together could have stopped him? I'm not sure I could have, even linked with Romonda and Lelaine. They were the next 2 strongest women in the camp, as strong in the power as Swan used to be. Swan visibly forced a scowl from her face, but even so, she snorted. She often said that if she could no longer be Amyrlin, then she would teach Egwene how to be the best Amyrlin ever, yet the transition from lion on a hill to mouse underfoot was difficult. Egwene allowed her no little latitude because of that. I want the 2 of you to ask about among those near the tent Moghedien was sleeping in. Someone must have seen the man. He had to come afoot. Anybody opening a gateway inside a space that little risked cutting her in 2, however small he wove it. Swan snorted, louder than the first time. Why bother? She growled. Do you mean to go chasing after like some fool hero in a Glee Man's fool story and bring her back? Maybe tie out all the Forsaken at one go? Win the last battle while you're at it? Even if we get a description head to toe, nobody knows one Forsaken from another. Nobody here, anyway. It's the most bloody useless barrel of fish guts I ever swung. Ignoring said sharply, sitting up straight. Monotone was one thing, but there were more. She did not put up with this even from Romonda. Color bloomed slowly on Swan's cheeks. Struggling to master herself, she kneaded her skirts and avoided the Egwene's eyes. Forgive me, she said finally. She almost sounded as if she meant it. It's been a difficult day for her mother, Lyanna put in with an impish smile. She was very good at those, though she generally used them to set some man's heart.
Hey, Basti, about to do
Not promiscuously,
a dab.
of course. She possessed discrimination and discretion in ample supply. But then most are. If she could only learn not to throw things at Gareth Bryn every time she gets angry. Enough, Egwene snapped. Lyanna was only trying to take a little of the pressure from Swan, but she was in no mood for it. I want to know anything I can learn about whoever threw Moghedien, even if it's just whether he's a fall. Any scrap that makes a shadow creeping in the dark. If that's not more than I have a right to ask. Lyanna sat quite still, staring at the flowers in the carpet in front of her toes. The redness spread to cover nearly Swan's whole face. With her fair skin, it made her look like a fountain. I humbly beg your pardon, Mother. This time she did sound humble. Her disappointment in Egwene's gaze was obvious. No, I humbly beg pardon. Egwene fingered her stole, letting the moment set.
What's cool about this one is I could take this part off and put
after a bit, she shifted uneasily on the
this part in the freezer.
When you knew you were in the wrong, silence.
Let it sit there a minute, freeze and get cold. Put the nail back on and do dabs. And it won't break that or anything.
Since I can't recall what I should forgive, she said at last, quietly. There seems to
Which
be
is pretty cool.
But Swan.
Well, Ridgie has that one on it.
A
Versus
hint
the
of wry
titanium.
laughter curled the corners of Swan's mouth. If I may say so, I seem to very well. But
I put my titanium on there because I could. Well, it's easier for me to regulate the heat because I know that now. The titanium versus this one. Because this is my brother's. This is Most Hated Growers. And I guess that comes with the quartz one. But
the headachy feeling was back again.
I gotta
Jaisa claimed it came from
get this
too
dialed
little
in and
sleep, but sleeping was
heating it and
felt taut
get
as a
the feel
drumhead.
for it.
It would take a larger head
versus
than
this
hers not
one.
to feel tight, stuffed
Already,
with as many worries as she had.
that's my old
Well, at
one
least
from
now
one of
she
my
could
old
pass on the secrets
nectar
that had
collectors.
kept
So I already
Morgadian
kind
hidden.
of
How to weave
judge the
disguises
heat
with
and
power and how
whatnot
to mask
versus
vulnerability from other women who could channel.
this is hard to see
Revealing those had
the
been
color
too risky
change
when they might have led
versus
to unmasking Morgadian.
the color change in the
A
titanium.
bit more acclaim, she thought wryly. There had been great petting and exclaiming when she announced the once lost secret of traveling, which at least had been her own, and more praise since for every one of the secrets she had learned about Morgadian, like pulling a back tooth each time. None of the acclaim made an ounce of difference in her position, though. You could pat a talented child on the head without forgetting she was a child.
Did you have any luck in your
Liana
fishing?
departed with a curtsy and a dry
Bassing?
comment that she was not sorry somebody else would have less than a full night's rest for once. Swan waited. No one could be allowed to see her and Liana leaving together. For a time, Egwene merely studied the other woman. Neither spoke. Swan seemed lost in thought. Finally, she gave a start and stood, straightening her dress, plainly preparing to go. Swan, Egwene began slowly, and found herself uncertain how to continue. Swan thought she understood. You were not only right, Mother, she said, looking Egwene straight in the eye. You were lenient. Too lenient, though I say it who shouldn't. You are the Amerlin seat, and no one may be insolent or impertinent to you. If you'd given me a penance that made even Ramonda feel sorry for me, it would have been no more than I deserved. I will remember that next time, Egwene said, and Swan bowed her head as if in acceptance. Maybe it was. Unless the changes in her ran deeper than seemed possible, there almost certainly would be a next time, and more after that. But what I want to ask about is Lord Bryn. All expression vanished from Swan's face. Are you sure you wouldn't like me to intervene? Why would I want that, Mother? Swan's voice was blander than cold water soup. The only duties I have are teaching you the etiquette of your office and handing Shiriam reports from my eyes and ears. She still retained some of her former network, though it was doubtful any knew who their reports went to now. Gareth Bryn hardly requires enough of my time.
How's everyone doing tonight?
She almost always referred to him that way, and even when she used his title, she put a bite into it. Swan, a burned barn and a few cows couldn't cost that much. Not compared with paying and feeding all those soldiers, certainly. But she had offered before, and the stiff reply was the same. I thank you, Mother, but no. I won't have him saying I break my word, and I swore to work the debt off. Abruptly, Swan's stiffness dissolved. Swan's stiffness dissolved in laughter, rare when she spoke about Lord Bryn. Scowls were much more common. If you need to worry about somebody, worry about me. I need no help handling Gareth Bryn. And that was the strange part. Weak she might be in the One Power now, but not so weak that Swan had to keep on as his servant, spending hours up to her elbows in hot soapy water with his shirts and small clothes. Perhaps she did so in order to have someone at hand on whom she could loose the temper she was otherwise forced to keep in a sack. Whatever the reason, it occasioned no little talk, and confirmed her oddness in many eyes. She was Aes Sedai, after all, if rather far down. His methods of dealing with her temper, once she threw plates and boots anyway, outraged her and provoked threats of dire consequences. Yet though she could have wrapped him up unable to stir a finger, Swan never touched Saidar around him, not to do his chores, and not even when it meant being turned over his knee. That fact she had kept hidden from most so far, but some things slipped out when she was in a rage, or when Liana was in a humor. There seemed to be no explanation. Swan was not weak-spirited or a fool. She was neither meek nor afraid. She was not... You might as well be on your way, Swan. Clearly, some secrets were not going to be revealed tonight. It's late, and I know you want your bed. Yes, mother. And thank you, she added, though Egwene could not have said for what. After Swan left, Egwene rubbed her temples once more. She wanted to pace. The tent would not do it. It might be the largest in the camp, occupied by just one person, but that meant less than 2 spans by 2, and it was crowded with cot and chair and stool, washstand and stand mirror, and no fewer than 3 chests full of clothes. Chaser had seen to those last, and Shiriam and Ramonda and Lelaine and a dozen more sitters. They kept seeing to them. A few more gifts of silk shifts or stockings, one more dress grand enough to receive a king, and there would be need for a 4th chest. Maybe Shiriam and the sitters hoped all the fine dresses would blind her to anything else, but Chesa just thought the Amyrlin seat had to be clothed suitably for her station. Servants, it seemed, believed in following the correct rituals as much as the hall ever did. Shortly, Selene would be there. It was her turn to undress Egwene for bed, another ritual. Only between her head and her restless feet, she was not ready for bed yet. Leaving the lamps burning, she hurried out before Selene could arrive. Walking would clear her head, and maybe tire her enough that she could sleep soundly. Putting herself to sleep would be no problem. The wise one Dreamwalkers had taught herself that skill early on. Yet finding any rest in it was another matter, especially when her mind boiled with a list of worries that began with Ramonda and Lelaine and Shiriam, then ran through Rand, Elida, Moghedien, Bellwether, and on out of sight. She avoided the area near Moghedien's tent. If she asked questions herself, too much importance would be given to a servant running away. Discretion had become part of her. The game she played allowed few slips, and being careless where you knew it did not matter could lead to be careless where it did. Worse, you could discover you had been wrong about where it mattered. The weak must be bold cautiously. That was Swan again. She truly did her best to teach, and she knew this particular game very well. There were no more people out and about in the moon-shadowed camp than there had been before. Handfuls slouched wearily around low fires, exhausted by their evening labors after a hard day's journey. Those who saw her rose tiredly to make their courtesies as she passed, murmuring, "The light shine on you, mother," or something like, occasionally asking her blessing, which she gave with a simple, "The light bless you, my child." Men and women old enough to be her grandparents sat back down, beaming from that. Yet she wondered what they actually believed about her, what they knew. All the Aes Sedai presented an unbroken front to the outside world, including their own servants. But Swan said that if you believed a servant knew twice what he should, you only knew half the truth. Still, those bows and curtsies and murmurs followed her from one clump of people to the next, comforting her with the possibility that there were some at least who did not see her as a child the hall brought out when they needed her. As she passed an open area surrounded by ropes tied to posts driven into the ground, a gateway's silver slash of light flashed vivid in the darkness as it rotated open. It was not really light, though. It cast no shadows. She paused to watch beside a corner post. No one at the nearby fires even looked up. They were used to this by now. A dozen or more sisters, twice as many servants, and a number of warders bustled out, returning with messages and wicker cages of pigeons from the dovecotes in Salidar, a good 500 miles west and south as the goose flew. They began scattering before the gateway closed, carrying their burdens to sitters, to their ajahs, a few back to their own tents. Most nights, seldom trusted anyone else to fetch messages destined for her, even if most were in codes or ciphers. Sometimes the world seemed to hold more networks of eyes and ears than it did Aes Sedai, though most were severely truncated by circumstance. The majority of agents for the various ajahs seemed to be lying low until the difficulties in the White Tower subsided, and a good many of the individual sisters' eyes and ears had no idea where the woman they served was at present. Several of the warders saw Egwene and made careful bows, with a respect proper to the stole. Sisters might eye her askance, but the hall had raised her Amyrlin, and the Gaidin needed no more. A number of the servants offered bows or curtsies too, Not one of the Aes Sedai hurrying away from the gateway so much as glanced in her direction. Perhaps they did not notice her. Perhaps. In a way that anybody could still hear from any of their eyes and ears at all was one of Moghedien's gifts. The sisters with the strength to make gateways had all been in Salidar long enough to know it well. Those who could weave a gateway of useful size were able to travel almost anywhere from there and land right on the spot. Trying to travel to Salidar, however, would have meant spending half of each night learning the new roped-off patch of ground, more for some, every time they made camp. What Egwene had pried from Moghedien was a way to journey from a place you did not know well to one you did. Slower than traveling, skimming was not one of the lost talents. No one had ever heard of it, so even the name was credited to Egwene. Anyone who could travel could skim, so every night sisters skimmed to Salidar, checking the dovecotes for birds that had returned to where they had been hatched, then traveled back. The sight should have pleased her. The rebel Aes Sedai had gained talents the White Tower thought lost forever, as well as learned new ones, and those abilities would help cost Elaida the Amyrlin seat before all was done. Yet instead of pleasure, Egwene felt sourness. Being snubbed had nothing to do with it, or not much anyway. As she walked on, the fires grew farther between, then faded behind. All around her lay the dark shapes of wagons, most with canvas tops stretched over iron hoops, and tents glowing palely in the moonlight. Beyond, the army's campfires climbed the surrounding hills all around. The stars brought to ground. The silence from Caemlyn tied her middle into knots, whatever anyone else thought. The very day they left Salidar, a message had arrived, though Shiriam had not bothered to show it to her until a few days ago, and then with repeated warnings on the need to keep the contents secret. The Hall knew, but no one else must. More of the 10,000 secrets that infested the camp. Egwene was sure she never would have seen it if she had not kept going on about Rand. She could recall every carefully chosen word, written in a tiny hand on paper so thin it was a wonder the pen had not torn through. We are well settled at the inn of which we spoke, and we have met with the wool merchant. He is a very remarkable young man, everything that Nynaeve told us. Still, he was courteous. I think he is somewhat afraid of us, which is to the good. It will go well. You may have heard rumors about men here, including a fellow from Saldaea. The rumors are all too true, I fear, but we have seen none of them and will avoid them if we can. If you pursue 2 hares, both will escape you. Verin and Alana are here, with a number of young women from the same region as the wool merchant. I will try to send them all to you. Alana has formed an attachment to the wool merchant, which may prove useful, though it is troubling, too. All will go well, I am sure. Marana. Shiriam emphasized the good news as she saw it. Marana, an experienced negotiator, had reached Caemlyn and been well received by Rand, the wool merchant. Wonderful news to Shiriam. And Verin and Alana would be bringing 2 Rivers girls to become novices. Shiriam was sure they must be coming down the same road they themselves were headed up. She seemed to think Egwene would be all aglow at the expectation of seeing faces from home. Marana would handle everything. Marana knew what she was doing. That's a bucket of horse sweat, Egwene muttered at the night. A gap-toothed fellow carrying a large wooden bucket gave a start and gaped at her, so amazed he forgot to bow. Rand? Courteous? She had seen his first meeting with Coiron Saildane, Elaida's emissary. Overbearing summed it up nicely. Why should he be different with Marana? And Marana thought he was afraid, thought that was good. Rand was seldom afraid even when he should be, and if he was now, Marana should remember that fear could make the mildest man dangerous. Remember that Rand was dangerous just being who he was. And what was this attachment Alana had formed? Egwene did not entirely trust Alana. The woman did extremely odd things at times, maybe impetuously, and maybe with some deeper motive. Egwene would not put it past her to find a way into Rand's bed. It would be clay in the hands of a woman like her. Elaine would break Alana's neck if that was so, but that was the least of it. Worst of all, no more of the pigeons Marana had taken with her had appeared in the Salidar dovecotes. Marana should have had some word to say, if only that she and the rest of the embassy had been tiring. Lately, the wise ones did little more than acknowledge Rand was alive, yet it seemed he was there, sitting on his arms as far as she could make out, which should have been a warning beacon. Shiriam saw it differently. Who could say why any man did what he did? Probably not even the man himself most of the time. And when it came to what he would channel, silence proved all was right. Marana surely would have reported any real difficulty. She must be on her way to Kyrian, if not there already, and there was no need to report further until she could send word of success. For that matter, Rand in Kyrian was success of a sort. One of Marana's goals, if not the most important, had been to ease him out of Canaan, so that Elaine could return there safely and take the lion throne. The dangers of Kyrian had dissipated. Incredibly, said Cora and her embassy had left the city on their way back to Tarvalin. Or maybe not so incredible. It all made a sort of sense, given Rand, given the way Aes Sedai did things. Even so, to Egwene, it all felt wrong. I have to go to him, she muttered. 1 hour and she could straighten everything out. Underneath, if Egwene had not had herself and only just managed not to say Moghedien's name. The taller woman fell in beside her, keeping a careful watch for other sisters as they walked. Lyanna did not have Swan's excuse for spending time with her. Not that being seen together once should cause any harm, but should not isn't always will not, Egwene reminded herself. Slipping the scroll from her shoulders, she folded it to carry in one hand. Lyanna might well be taken despite her dress. Many expected the banded white dresses to wear one all the time. From a distance, Egwene might be taken for one too. Not the most pacifying thought. Theodrin and Fairlane are asking around near Marrigan's tent, Mother. They weren't especially pleased. I did a fine sulk over carrying messages, if I do say so. Theodrin had to stop Fairlane dressing me down for it. But Lyanna's laughter was quiet and aggressive. Situations that grated Swan. She was critical of most of the other sisters for how well they did. Good, Egwene said absently. Marana misstepped somehow, Lyanna, or he wouldn't be staying in Kyrian and she wouldn't be keeping quiet. Off in the distance, a dog bayed at the moon, then others, until they were abruptly silenced by shouts that perhaps luckily she could not quite understand. A number of the soldiers had dogs tagging along. There were none in the Aes Sedai camp. Any number of cats, but no dogs. Lyanna does know what she's doing. It sounded very like a sigh. Lyanna and Swan both agreed with Shiriam. Everyone did, except her. When you give someone a task, you have to trust it to them. Egwene sniffed and folded her arms. Lyanna, that man could strike sparks from a damp cloth if it wore the shawl. I don't know Marana, but I've never seen an Aes Sedai who qualified as a damp cloth. I've met one or two, Lyanna chuckled. This time her sigh was plain. But not Marana, true. Does he really believe he has friends inside the tower? Alviarin? That might make him difficult, I suppose. But I can hardly see Alviarin doing anything to risk her place. She was always ambitious enough for 3. He says he has a letter from her. She could still see Rand gloating over receiving letters from Elaida and Alviarin both, back before she herself left Kyrian. Maybe her ambitions make her think she can replace Elaida with him on her side. That's if she really wrote it, if it exists. He thinks he's clever, Lyanna, but he doesn't believe he knows what. Rand would go on thinking he could handle anything by himself right up until one of those anythings crushed him. I know him inside and out, Lyanna. Being around the Wise Ones seems to have infected him, or maybe he infected them. Whatever the sitters think, whatever any of you think, an Aes Sedai's shawl doesn't impress him any more than it does the Wise Ones. Sooner or later, he'll exasperate his sister until she does something about it, or one of them will push him the wrong way, not realizing how strong he is and what his temper is now. After that, there might be a back. I'm the only one who can deal with him safely. The only one. He can hardly be as irritating as those Aiel women, Lyanna murmured wryly. Even she found it difficult to be amused by her experiences with the Wise Ones. But it hardly matters. The Amyrlin seat being valued with the White Tower itself. A pair of women appeared between the tents ahead, moving slowly as they talked. Distance and shadow obscured their faces, yet it was clear they were Aes Sedai from the way they carried themselves, an assurance that nothing hiding in any darkness could harm them. No accepted on the brink of the Shawl could manage quite that degree of confidence. A queen with an army at her back might not. They were coming toward her and Lyanna. Lyanna quickly turned into the deeper dimness between two wagons. Scowling with frustration, Egwene nearly pulled her out again. Let it all out. She would stand before the hall and tell them it was time they realized the Amyrlin's stole was more than a pretty scarf. She would... Following Lyanna, she motioned the other woman to walk on. What she would not do was throw everything on the midden heap in a fit of pique. Only one tower law specifically limited the power of the Amyrlin seat. A fistful of irritating customs and a barrel full of inconvenient realities, but only one law. Yet it could not have been a worse for her purposes. The Amyrlin seat being valued with the White Tower itself as the very heart of the White Tower, she must not be endangered without dire necessity. Therefore, unless the White Tower be at war by declaration of the Hall of the Tower, the Amyrlin seat shall seek the lesser consensus of the Hall of the Tower before deliberately placing herself in the way of any danger, and she shall abide by the consensus that stands. What rash incident by an Amyrlin had inspired that, Egwene did not know, but it had been law for something over 2,000 years. To most Aes Sedai, any law that old attained an aura of holiness. Changing it was unthinkable. Romonda had quoted that bloody law as though lecturing a half-wit. If the daughter heir of Andor could not be allowed within 100 miles of the Dragon Reborn, how much more they must preserve the Amyrlin seat. Lelaine sounded almost regretful, most likely because she was agreeing with Romonda. That had nearly curdled both their tongues. Without them, both of them, the lesser consensus lay as far out of reach as the greater. Light, even that declaration of war only required the lesser consensus. So if she could not obtain permission, Lyanna cleared her throat. You can hardly do much if you go in secret, Mother, and the Hall will find out, soon or late. I think you would find it difficult to have an hour to yourself after that. Not that they dare put a guard on you, precisely, but there are ways. I can quote examples from certain sources. She never mentioned the hidden records directly unless they were behind a ward. Am I so transparent? Egwene asked after a moment. There were only wagons around them here, and beneath the wagons the dark mounds of sleeping wagon drivers and horse handlers and all the rest needed to keep so many vehicles moving. It was remarkable just how many conveyances over 300 Aes Sedai required, when few would condescend to ride even a mile in a wagon or cart. But there were tents and furnishings and foodstuffs, and 1,000 things needed to keep the sisters and those who served them. The loudest sounds here were snores, a chorus of frogs. No, Mother, Lyanna laughed softly. I just thought what I would do. But it's well known I've lost all my dignity and sense. The Amyrlin seat can hardly take me for a model. I think you must let young Master Alfor go as he will, for a time anyway, while you pluck the goose that's in front of you. His way may lead us all to the pit of doom, Egwene muttered, but it was not an argument. There had to be a way to pluck that goose and still keep Rand from making dangerous mistakes, but she could not see it now. Not frogs. Those snores sounded like 100 saws cutting logs full of knots. This is as bad a spot for a soothing walk as I've ever visited. I think I might as well go to bed. Lyanna tilted her head. In that case, Mother, if you will forgive me, there's a man in Lord Bryn's camp. After all, who ever heard of a green without even one order? From the sudden quickening in her voice, you might have thought she was off to meet a lover. Considering what Egwene had heard about greens, perhaps there was not that much difference. Back among the tents, the last of the fires had been doused with dirt. No one took risks with fire when the countryside was tinder dry. A few tendrils of smoke rose lazily in the moonlight where the job had not been well done. A man murmured drowsily in his sleep inside a tent, and here and there a cough drifted out or a rasping snore, but otherwise the camp lay silent and still. Which was why Egwene was surprised when someone stepped from the shadows in front of her, especially someone wearing the simple white dress of a novice. "Mother, I need to speak to you." "Nicola?" Egwene had made a point of fixing name to face for every novice, no easy chore given how this was hunted all along the army's path for girls and young women who could learn. Active search was still not well thought of. Custom was to wait for the girl to ask, best of all to wait for her to come to the tower, but 10 times as many novices studied in the camp now as the White Tower had held in years. Nicola was one to be remembered, though, and besides, Egwene had often noticed the young woman staring at her. "Tiana won't be pleased if she finds you up this late." Tiana Nozella was the mistress of novices, known equal comforting shoulder when a novice needed to cry, and an unyielding stance when it came to rules. The other woman shifted as if to hurry away, then straightened her back. Sweat glistened on her cheeks. The darkness was cooler than the light had been, but not what anyone would call cool, and the simple trick of ignoring heat or cold came only with the shawl. "I know I'm supposed to ask to see Tiana Sedai and then ask her to see you, Mother, but she'd never let a novice approach the Amyrlin seat." "About what, child?" Egwene asked. The woman was older by 6 or 7 years at least, but that was the proper address for a novice. Fidgeting with her skirt, Nicola stepped closer. Large eyes met Egwene's perhaps more directly than a novice's should have. "Mother, I want to go as far as I can." Her hands plucked at her dress, but her voice was cool and self-possessed, fit for an Aes Sedai. "I won't say they are holding me back, but I am sure I can become stronger than they say. I just know I can. You were never held back, Mother. No one has ever gained so much of her strength as fast as you. All I ask is the same chance." Movement in the shadow behind Nicola turned into another sweaty-faced woman, this one in short coat and wide trousers, carrying a bow. Her hair hung to her waist in a braid tied with 6 ribbons, and she wore short boots with raised heels. Nicola Treehill and Arena Nermasiv seemed an odd pair to be friends. Like many of the older novices, women with nearly 10 years on Egwene were tested now, though many sisters still grumbled that they were 10 years too old to accept novice discipline. Like many of those older women, Nicola was ferocious in her desire to learn, by all reports, and she had a potential bettered only by Nynaeve, Elaine, and Egwene herself among living Aes Sedai. In fact, Nicola apparently was making great strides, often great enough that her teachers had to slow her down. Some said she had begun picking up weaves as if she already knew them. Not only that, but she already demonstrated 2 talents, although the ability to see ta'veren was minor, while the major talent, foretelling, emerged so that no one understood what she had foretold. She herself did not remember a word she said. All in all, Nicola was already marked by the sisters as someone to watch despite her late start. The begrudging agreement to test women older than 17 or 18 probably could be laid at Nicola's feet. Arena, on the other hand, was a hunter for the horn who swaggered as much as a man and sat around talking of adventures, those she had had and those she would, when she was not practicing with her bow. Very likely she had picked that weapon up from Brigitte, along with her manner of dress. She certainly seemed to have no interest in anything beside the bow, except flirting occasionally in a rather forward manner, though not lately. Perhaps long days on the road left her too tired for it, if not for archery. Why she was still traveling with them, Egwene could not understand. It was hardly likely that Arena believed the Horn of Valir would turn up along their march, and impossible that she even suspected it was hidden away inside the White Tower. Very few people knew that. Egwene was not certain even Halyda did. Arena seemed a posturing fool, but Egwene felt a certain sympathy for Nicola. She understood the woman's discontent, understood wanting to know it all now. She had been that way too. Maybe she still was. Nicola, she said gently, we all have limits. I'll never match Nynaeve Sedai, for example, whatever I do. But if I could only have the chance, Mother. Nicola actually wrung her hands in pleading, and there was a touch of it in her voice, yet her eyes still met Egwene's levelly. The chance you had. What I did, because I had no choice, because I didn't know better, is called forcing, Nicola, and it is dangerous. She had not heard that term until Siuan apologized for doing it to her. That was one time Siuan truly had seemed repentant. You know, if you try to channel more of saidar than you're ready to handle, you burn yourself out before you ever come close to your full strength. Best you learn to be patient. The sisters won't let you be anything else until you are ready anyway. We came to Salidar on the same riverboat as Nynaeve and Elaine, Arena said suddenly. Her gaze was more than direct. It was challenging. And Birgitta. For some reason, she said the name bitterly. Nicola made shushing motions. I need to bring that up. Oddly, she did not sound as if she meant it. Hoping she was keeping her face half so smooth as Nicola's, Egwene tried to quell a sudden uneasiness. Marigan had come to Salidar on that boat too. An owl hooted, and she shivered. Some people thought hearing an owl in moonlight meant bad news was coming. She was not superstitious, but no need to bring up what? The other two women exchanged looks, and Arena nodded. It was on the walk from the river to the village. For all her supposed reluctance, Nicola peered straight into Egwene's eyes. Arena and I heard Tom Marilyn and Juilin Sandar talking, the Gleeman and the thief-taker. Juilin said if there were Aes Sedai in the village, we weren't sure yet, and they learned Nynaeve and Elaine had been pretending to be Aes Sedai, then we were all jumping into a school of Silverpike, which I take it isn't very safe. The Gleeman saw us and hushed him, Arena put in, fingering the quiver at her waist. But we heard. Her voice was hard as her stare. I know they're both Aes Sedai now, Mother, but wouldn't they still be in trouble if anyone found out? The sisters, I mean? Anyone who pretends to be a sister is in trouble if they find out, even years later. Nicola's face did not change, but her gaze suddenly seemed to be trying to fix Egwene's. She leaned a little forward, intent. Anybody at all? Isn't that so? Emboldened by Egwene's silence, Arena grinned, an unpleasant grin in the night. I hear Nynaeve and Elaine were sent out of the tower on some task by the Sanche woman back when she was Amerlin. I hear you were sent off by her too at the same time. Got into all sorts of trouble when you came back. Sly insinuation slithered into her voice. Do you remember them playing at Aes Sedai? They stood there looking at her, Arena leaning insolently on her bow, Nicola so expectant the air should have crackled. Siuan Sanche is Aes Sedai, Egwene said coldly, and so are Nynaeve Almira and Elaine Trakand. You will show them proper respect. To you they are Siuan Sedai, Nynaeve Sedai, and Elaine Sedai. The pair blinked in surprise. Inside her stomach quivered with outrage. After everything she had been through tonight, she was confronted with blackmail from these. She could not think of a word bad enough. Elaine could have. Elaine listened to stablemen and wagon drivers and every sort, memorizing the words she should have refused to hear. Unfolding the striped stole, Egwene draped it carefully across her shoulders. I don't think you understand, Mother, Nicola said hastily. Not fearfully, however, just attempting to force her point. I merely worried that if anyone found out that you had... Egwene gave her no chance to go further. Oh, I understand, child. The fool woman was a child, however old she was. Any number of the older novices gave trouble, usually in the form of insolence toward accepted, set to teach them. But even the silliest had sense enough to avoid impertinence to the sisters. It fanned her anger to white heat that the woman had the gall to try this on with her. They were both taller than she, if not by much, but she planted her fists on her hips and drew herself up. and they shrank away as though she loomed. Do you have any notion how serious it is to bring charges against a sister, especially for a novice? Charges based on a conversation you claim to have heard between men now 1,000 miles away? Tiana would skin you alive and put you to scrubbing pots the rest of your natural life. Nicola kept trying to push a word in. Apologies, they sounded like this time, and more protests, but Egwene did not understand. Frantic attempts to change everything, but Egwene ignored her and rounded on Arena. The hunter took another step back, wetting her lips and looking remarkably uncertain. You needn't think you would walk away clear either. Even a hunter could be hauled to Tiana for a thing like this. If you're lucky enough not to be flogged at a wagon tongue, the way they do soldiers caught stealing. Either way, you'll be tossed out by the road with your welts for company. Drawing a deep breath, Egwene folded her hands at her waist. Clutched together, they would not tremble. All but cowering, the pair looked suitably chastened. She hoped those downcast eyes and slumped shoulders and shifting feet were not feigned. By rights, she should send them to Tiana right now. She had no idea what the penalty might be for trying to blackmail the Amerlin seat, but it seemed likely that being turned out of the camp would be the least of it. In Nicola's case, the turning out would have to wait until her teachers were satisfied she knew enough of channeling not to hurt herself or others by accident. Nicola Treehill would never be Aes Sedai, though, once that charge was laid against her. All that potential would go for nothing. Except any woman caught pretending to be Aes Sedai was set down so hard she would still be whimpering years later, and an accepted caught might very well consider the other woman fortunate. But surely Nynaeve and Elaine were safe, now they really were sisters, herself as well. Only it might take no more than a whisper of this to erase any chance of making the Hall acknowledge her truly the Amerlin seat. As well jaunt off to Rand, and then tell the Hall to their faces. She dared not allow these two to see her doubt, or even suspect. I will forget this, she said sharply. But if I hear so much as a whisper of it again from anyone, she drew a ragged breath. If she heard shouts of it, there might be little she could do. But by the way they jumped, they read a threat that pricked deep. Get to your beds before I change my mind. In an instant, they became a flurry of curtsies, of yes, mother, and no, mother, and as you command, mother. They scurried away, looking back over their shoulders at her, every step faster than the last, until they were running. She had to walk on sedately, but she wanted to run too. Chapter 10. Unseen Eyes. Selene was waiting when Egwene got back to her tent, a rail-thin woman with dark Tyran coloring and a nearly impervious self-assurance. Chaser was right. She did carry her long nose raised, as though recoiling from a bad smell. Yet, if her manner with the other maids was arrogant, she was in reality quite different around her patroness. As Egwene entered, Selene folded herself into a curtsy so deep her head nearly brushed the carpet, skirts spread as wide as they would go in the cramped quarters. Before Egwene had taken her second step inside, the woman leaped up, fussing over her buttons, and fussing over her, too. Selene had very little sense. Oh, mother, you went out with your head uncovered again. As if she had ever worn any of those beaded caps the woman favored, or the embroidered velvet things Mary favored, or Chase's plumed hats. Why, you're shivering. You should never go walking out of doors without a shawl and parasol, mother. How was a parasol supposed to stop shivering? With sweat trickling down her own cheeks, however fast she dabbed with her handkerchief, Selene never thought to ask why she shivered, which was perhaps just as well. And you went alone in the night. It just isn't proper, mother. Besides, there are all those soldiers, rough men, with no decent respect for anyone, even Aes Sedai. Mother, you simply mustn't. Egwene let the foolish words wash over her in the same way she let the woman undress her, paying less than half a mind. Ordering her to be quiet would only produce so many hurt looks and abused sighs that it made little difference. Except for the brainless chatter, Selene performed her duties diligently, if with so many flourishes they became a dance of rapid and obsequious curtsies. It It seemed impossible that anyone could be as silly as Selene, always concerned with appearances, always worrying over what people would think. To her, people were Aes Sedai and the nobility and their upper servants. By her book, no one else mattered. Perhaps no one else thought by her book. It probably was impossible. Egwene was not about to forget who had found Selene in the first place, any more than she did who had found Mary. True, Chaisa was a gift from Shiriam, but Chaisa had shown her loyalties to Egwene more than once. Egwene wanted to tell herself the tremors that the other woman took for shivers were quivers of rage, yet she knew a worm of fear writhed in her belly. She had come too far, had too much to do yet, to allow Nicola and Arena to put a spoke through her wheels. As her head popped through the top of a clean shift, she caught a bit of the skinny woman's prattle and stared. Did you say ewe's milk? Oh, yes, Mother. Your skin is so soft, and nothing will keep it that way like bathing in ewe's milk. Maybe she really was an idiot. Hustling a protesting Selene out, Egwene brushed her own hair, turned down her own cot, placed the now useless Idom bracelet in the small carved ivory box where she kept her few pieces of jewelry, then extinguished the lamps. All by myself, she thought sarcastically in the darkness. Selene and Mary will have conniptions. Before retiring, however, she padded to the entrance and opened a small gap in the door flaps. Outside was moonlit stillness and silence, broken by a night heron's cry that suddenly cut off in a shriek. There were hunters abroad in the darkness. After a moment, something moved in the shadows beside a tent across the way. It looked like a woman. Perhaps idiocy did not disqualify Selene any more than dour-faced gloom eliminated Mary. It could be either one, or someone else entirely. Even Nicola or Arena, however unlikely. She let the tent flap fall shut with a smile. Whoever the watcher was would not see where she went tonight. The way the wise ones had taught her to put herself to sleep was simple. Eyes closed, feeling each part of the body relax in turn, breathing in time with her heartbeat, mind unfocused and drifting, all but one tiny corner, drifting. Sleep swept over her in moments, but it was the sleep of a dream walker. Formless, she floated deep within an ocean of stars, infinite points of light glimmering in an infinite sea of darkness, fireflies beyond counting flickering in an endless night. Those were dreams, the dreams of everyone sleeping anywhere in the world, maybe of everyone in all possible worlds, and this was the gap between reality and Tel'aran'rhiod, the space separating the waking world from the world of dreams. Wherever she looked, 10,000 fireflies vanished as people woke, and 10,000 new were born to replace them. A vast, ever-changing array of sparkling beauty. She did not waste time in admiration, though. This place held dangers, some deadly. She was sure she knew how to avoid those, but one peril in this place aimed straight at her if she lingered too long, and being caught in it would be embarrassing to say the least. Keeping a wary eye out, well, it would have been a wary eye had she had eyes here. She moved. She had no sense of motion. It seemed she stood still, and that glittering ocean swirled around her until one light settled before her. Every twinkling star looked exactly like every other, yet she knew this was Nynaeve's dream. How she knew was another matter. Not even the wise ones understood that recognition. She had considered trying to find Nicola's dreams and Arena's. Once she unearthed them, she knew exactly how to sink the fear of the light into their bones, and she did not give a fig that every bit of it was prescribed. Practicality sent her here instead, not fear of the forbidden. She had done what was not done before, and she was certain she would again should it become necessary. Do what you must, then pay the price for it, was what she had been taught, by the same women who had marked off those forbidden areas. It was refusal to admit the debt, refusal to pay, that often turned necessity to evil. But even if that pair were asleep, locating someone's dreams the first time was arduous at best, without guarantees. Days of efforts, nights of it rather, were more likely to deliver nothing. This was at least sure. Slowly she moved closer through everlasting darkness. though once again it seemed that she stayed still and the pinpoint of light grew to a glowing pearl, an iridescent apple, a full moon, until it filled her vision entirely with brightness, all the world. She did not touch it, though, not yet. A space finer than a hair remained between. Ever so gently she reached across that gap. With what, lacking a body, was as much a mystery as how she knew one dream from another. Her will, the wise ones said, but she still did not understand how that could be. As though laying a finger to a soap bubble, she kept her touch very delicate indeed. The shining wall shimmered like spun glass, pulsed like a heart, delicate and alive. A little firmer touch and she would be able to see inside, see what Nynaeve was dreaming. A bit firmer still and she could actually step inside and be a part of the dream. That carried hazards, especially with anyone of a strong mind, but either looking in or stepping in could be mortifying. For example, if the dreamer happened to be dreaming of a man she was particularly interested in. Apologies alone took half the night when you did that. Or with a hooking sort of motion, like rolling a fragile bead across a tabletop, she could snatch Nynaeve out into a dream of her own making, a part of Tel'aran'rhiod itself, where she was in complete control. She was sure that would work. Of course, that was one of the forbidden things, and she did not think Nynaeve would appreciate it. Nynaeve, this is Egwene. Under no circumstances are you to return until you find the bowl. Not until I can settle a problem with Arena and Nicola. They know you were pretending. I will explain more when I see you next in the little tower. Be careful, Moghedien has escaped. The dream winked out. The soap bubble pricked. Despite the message, she would have giggled had she possessed a fruit. A disembodied voice in your dream could have a startling effect, especially if you were afraid the speaker might be Kiki. Nynaeve was not one to forget, even when it was an accident. That light-spangled sea whirled about her once more until she settled on another sparkling pinpoint, Elaine. The two women very likely slept no more than a dozen paces apart in Ebou Dar, but distance had no meaning here, or perhaps it had a different meaning. This time, when she delivered her message, the dream pulsed and changed. It still appeared exactly the same as every other, but even so, to her it was transformed. Had the words drawn Elaine into another dream? They would remain, however, and she would remember on waking. As Nicola and Arena's bowstrings dampened a little more, it was time to turn her attention to Rand. Unfortunately, finding his dreams would be as useless as finding an Aes Sedai's. He shielded his somewhat as they did theirs, although apparently a man's shield differed from a woman's. An Aes Sedai's shield was a crystal carapace, a seamless sphere woven of spirit, but however transparent it appeared, it might as well have been steel. She could not recall how many fruitless hours she had frittered away trying to peer through his. Where a sister's shielded dream seemed brighter close up, his were dimmer. It was like staring into muddy water. Sometimes you had the impression that something had moved deep in those gray-brown swirls, but you could never tell what. Again, the endless array of lights spun and settled, and she approached a third woman's dream, gingerly. So much lay between her and Amis that it seemed akin to approaching her mother's dreams. In truth, she had to admit, she wanted to emulate Amis in many ways. She desired Amis's respect every bit as greatly as she did the Hall's. Maybe, if she had to choose, she would choose Amis's. Certainly there was no sitter she esteemed as highly as she did Amis. Pushing away a sudden diffidence, she tried to make her voice softer, to no avail. Amis, this is Egwene. I must speak with you. We will come, a voice murmured to her, Amis's voice. Startled, Egwene backed away. She felt like laughing at herself. Perhaps it was just as well to be reminded that the wise ones had long years more experience at this. There were times she was afraid she might have been spoiled by not having to work harder for her abilities with the one power. Then again, as if to make up for it, sometimes everything else seemed like trying to climb a cliff in a rainstorm. Abruptly, she caught movement at the very edge of her field of vision. One of those points of light slid through the sea of stars, drifting toward her of its own volition, growing larger. Only one dream would do that. One dreamer. In a panic, she fled, wishing she had a throat to scream or curse or just shout, especially at the tiny corner of her that wanted to stay where she was and wait. Not even the stars moved this time. They simply disappeared, and she was leaning against a thick redstone column, panting as though she had sprinted a mile, heart beating fit to burst. After a moment, she looked down at herself and began to laugh a trifle unsteadily, trying to catch her breath. She had on a full-skirted gown of shimmering green silk, worked in thread of gold in wide, ornate bands across the bodice and along the hem. That bodice also showed considerably more bosom than she ever would waking, and a broad cinched belt of woven gold made her waist seem smaller than it really was. Then again, maybe it was smaller. Here in Tel'aran'rhiod you could be however you wanted, whatever you wanted, even when the wanting was unconscious if you were not careful. Gawyn Trakand had unfortunate effects on her, very unfortunate. That tiny part of her still wished she'd waited to be overtaken by his dream, overtaken and absorbed by it. If a dream walker loved somebody with attraction, or hated them beyond reason, most especially if the emotion was returned, she could be pulled into that person's dream. She drew the dream, or it drew her, as a lodestone drew iron filings. She certainly did not hate Gawyn, but she could not afford to be trapped in his dream, not tonight. Trapped until he wakened, being as he saw her, which was a good deal more beautiful than she truly was. Oddly, he appeared less beautiful than he was in life. There was no question of a strong mind or concentration when love or hate that strong was involved. Once you were in that dream, there you remained until the other person stopped dreaming about you. Remembering what he dreamed of doing with her, what they had done in his dreams, she felt a fiery blush suffusing her face. A good thing none of the sitters can see me now, she muttered. They'd never take me for anything but a girl then. Grown women did not flutter and moon over a man this way. She was certain of that. Not women with any sense, anyway. What he dreamed of would come, but at a time of her choosing. Obtaining her mother's permission might be difficult, yet surely she would not withhold it, even if she had never laid eyes on Gawyn. Maren Al'Vir trusted her daughter's judgment. Now it was time for her youngest daughter to show a little of that judgment and put these fancies away until a better time. Looking around, she almost wished she could go on letting Gawyn fill her thoughts. More massive columns ran in every direction, supporting a soaring vaulted ceiling and a great dome. None of the gilded lamps hanging from golden chains overhead was lit, yet there was light of a sort, light that was just there, without source, neither bright nor dim. The heart of the stone, inside the great fortress called the Stone of Tyr, or rather its image in Tel'aran'rhiod, an image as real as the original in many ways. This was where she had met the wise ones before, their choice. A strange one for Aiel, it seemed to her. She would have expected Rhuidean, now that it was open, or somewhere else in the Aiel waste, or simply wherever the wise ones happened to be. Every place except Ogier Stedding had its reflection in the world of dreams. Even the Stedding did really, but they could not be entered, just as Rhuidean had once been closed. The Aes Sedai camp was out of the question, of course. A number of the sisters now had access to ter'angreal that allowed them to enter the world of dreams, and since none really knew what they were doing, they often began their ventures by appearing in the camp of Tel'aran'rhiod, as though setting out on a normal journey. Like Angreal and Sa'angreal, by Tower law, ter'angreal were the property of the White Tower, no matter who happened to possess them for the present. Very seldom did the Tower insist, at least when possession lay somewhere like the so-called Great Holding in this very Stone of Tyr. Eventually they would come to the Aes Sedai, and the White Tower had always been good at waiting when it needed to. But those actually in Aes Sedai hands were in the gift of the Hall of individual sitters. The loan, really. They were almost never given. Elayne had learned to duplicate Dream ter'angreal, and she and Nynaeve had taken 2 with them, but the rest were in the Hall's possession now, along with the other sorts Elayne had made. which meant that Shiriam and her little circle could use them whenever they wished, and most assuredly Lelaine and Romanda, though it was likely those two sent others instead of entering Tel'aran'rhiod Rhiod themselves. Until quite recently, no Aes Sedai had walked the dream in centuries, and they still had considerable difficulties, most of which stemmed from a belief that they could learn by themselves. Even so, the last thing Egwene wanted was any of their followers spying on this meeting tonight. As though the thought of spies had made her more sensitive, she became aware of being watched by unseen eyes. That sensation was always present in Tel'aran'rhiod, and not even the wise ones knew why. But although hidden eyes always seemed to be there, actual watchers might be present as well. It was not Romanda or Lelaine on her mind now. Trailing her hand against the column, she walked all the way around it slowly, studying the redstone forest as it ran away in deepening shadows. The light surrounding her was not real. Anybody in one of those shadows would see the same light around them while shadows hid her. People did appear, men and women, flickering images that rarely lasted more than a few heartbeats. She had no interest in those who touched the world of dreams in their sleep. Anyone might do that by happenstance, but luckily for them, only for moments, seldom long enough to face any of the dangers. The Black Ajah possessed Dream ter'angreal too, stolen from the tower. Worse, Moghedien knew Tel'aran'rhiod as well as any Dreamwalker. Perhaps better. She could control this place and anyone in it as easily as turning her hand. For a moment, Egwene wished she'd spied on Moghedien's dreams while the woman was prisoner, just once, just enough to be able to distinguish them. But even identifying her dreams would not reveal where she was now. And there had been the possibility of being drawn in against her will. She certainly despised Moghedien enough, and the Forsaken most assuredly hated her without bounds. What happened in there was not real, not even as real as in Tel'aran'rhiod, but you remembered it as if it was. A night in Moghedien's power would have been a nightmare she likely would have relived every time she went to sleep for the rest of her life. Maybe awake, too. Another circuit. What was that? A dark, regally beautiful woman in pearl-covered cap and lace-ruffed gown strode from the shadows and vanished. A Tyran woman dreaming, a high lady, or dreaming herself as one. She might be plain and dumpy, a farm wife or a merchant, awake. Better to have spied on Loghain than Moghedien. She still would not know where he was, but she might have some idea of his plans. Of course, being pulled into his dream might not have been much more pleasant than being drawn into Moghedien's. He hated all Aes Sedai. Arranging his escape had been one of those necessary things. She just hoped the price would not be too high. Forget Loghain. Moghedien was the danger. Moghedien who might come after her, even here, especially here. Moghedien who... Suddenly she became aware of how heavily she was moving, and made a vexed sound in her throat, very nearly a groan. The beautiful gown had become a full set of Clayton mail armor like that of Gareth Bryn's heavy cavalry. An open-faced helmet rested on her head, with a crest in the shape of the flame of Tar Valon by the field. It was very irritating. She was beyond this sort of lack of control. Firmly she changed the armor to what she had worn meeting the Wise Ones before. It was just a matter of thought. Full skirt of dark wool and loose white algoda blouse, just as she had worn while studying with them, complete with a fringed shawl so green it was nearly black, and a folded headscarf to hold her hair back. She did not duplicate their jewelry, of course, all the multitudes of necklaces and bracelets. They would laugh at her for that. A woman built her collection over the years, not in the blink of a dream. Loghain is on his way to the Black Tower, she said aloud. She certainly hoped he was. At least there would be some check on him then, or so she hoped. And if he was caught and gentled again, Rand could not blame any sister following her. And Moghedien has no way of knowing where I am. That, she tried to make sound a certainty. Why should you fear the shadow soul? Asked a voice behind her, and Egwene tried to climb into the air. This being Tel'aran'rhiod and she a dream-walker, she was more than her own height above the floor stones before she came to herself. Oh yes, she thought, floating. I'm far beyond all those beginner's mistakes. If this went on, next she would be jumping when Chesa gave her good morning. Hoping she was not blushing too badly, she let herself settle slowly. Perhaps she could retain a little dignity. Perhaps, yet Bear's aged face had more creases than usual from a grin that seemed nearly to touch her ears. Unlike the other two women with her, she could not channel, but that had nothing to do with dream walking. She was as skilled as either, more in some areas. Amis was smiling too, if not so broadly, but sun-haired Mylene threw back her head and roared. I have never seen anyone, Mylene just managed to get out, like a rabbit. She gave a little hop and lifted a full pace into the air. I recently caused Morgedian some hurt. Egwene was quite proud of her poise. She liked Mylene. The woman was much less thorny since she was with child, with twins actually. But at the moment Egwene could have strangled her cheerfully. Some friends and I damaged her pride, if not much more. I think she would like the opportunity to repay me. On impulse, she changed her clothes once more to the sort of riding dress she wore every day now, in lustrous green silk. The great serpent encircled her finger with gold. She could not tell them everything, but these women were friends too, and they deserved to know what she could tell. Wounds to the pride are remembered long after wounds to the flesh. Bear's voice was thin and high, yet strong, a reed of iron. Tell us about it, Mylene said, with an eager smile. How did you shame her? Bear's was just as enthusiastic. In a cruel land, you either learned to laugh at cruelty or spent your life weeping. In the threefold land, the Aiel had learned to laugh long since. Besides, shaming an enemy was considered an art. Amis studied Egwene's new clothes for a moment, then said, That can come later, I think. We are to talk, you said. She gestured to where the wise ones liked to talk, out beneath the vast dome at the heart of the chamber. Why they chose that spot was another mystery Egwene could not puzzle out. The three women settled themselves cross-legged, spreading their skirts neatly, only a few paces from what seemed to be a sword made of gleaming crystal, rising hilt first from where it had been driven into the floor stones. They paid it no mind whatsoever. It was no part of their prophecies, any more than they did the people who flashed into existence around the great chamber, but here was always where they came. Fabled Kalandor would indeed function as a sword despite its appearance, but in truth it was a male Sa'angreal, one of the most powerful ever made in the Age of Legends. She felt a little shiver, thinking of male Sa'angreal. It had been different when there was only Ram, and the Forsaken, of course. But now there were these Ashanan. With Kalandor, a man could draw enough of the one power to level a city in a heartbeat and devastate everything for miles. She walked wide around it, holding her skirts aside reflexively. From the heart of the stone, Rand had drawn Kalandor in fulfillment of the prophecies, then returned it for his own reasons. Returned it and snared it round with traps woven in Saidin. They would have their reflection too, one that might trigger as decisively as the original, should the wrong weaves be tried nearby. Some things in Tel'aran'rhiod were all too real. Trying not to think of the sword that is not a sword, Egwene placed herself before the three wise ones. Fastening their shawls around their waists, they unlaced their blouses. That was how Aiel women sat with friends, in their tents beneath the hot sun. She did not sit, and if that made her seem a supplicant or on trial, so be it. In a way, in her heart, she was. I've not told you why I was summoned away from you, and you have not asked. You will tell us when you are ready, Amis said complacently. She looked of an age with Mylene, despite hair white as Bear's tumbling to her waist. Her hair had begun turning when she was little older than Egwene, but she was the leader among the three, not Bear. For the first time, Egwene wondered just how old she was. Not a question you asked a wise one, any more than an Aes Sedai. When I left you, I was one of the accepted. You know about the division in the White Tower. Bear shook her head and grimaced. She knew, but she could not understand. None of them did. To Aiel, it was as unreal as clan or warrior society dividing against itself. Perhaps it was also affirmation in their eyes that Aes Sedai were less than they should be. Egwene went on, surprised that her voice was collected, steady. The sisters who oppose Elaida have raised me as their Amyrlin. When Elaida is pulled down, I will sit on the Amyrlin seat in the White Tower. She added the striped stole to her clothes and waited. Once she had lied to them, a serious transgression under Ji'ito, and she was not sure how they would react to learning this truth she had hidden. If only they believed, at least. They merely looked at her. "There is a thing children do," Melaine said carefully after a time. Her pregnancy did not show yet, but already she had the inner radiance, making her even more beautiful than usual, and an inward unshakable calm. Children all want to push spears, and they all want to be the clan chief. But eventually they realize that the clan chief seldom dances the spears himself. So they make a figure and set it on a rise. Off to one side, the floor suddenly mounded up, no longer stone tiles, but a ridge of sun-baked brown rock. Atop it stood a shape vaguely like a man, made of twisted twigs and bits of cloth. This is the clan chief who commands them to dance the spears from the hill where he can see the battle. But the children run where they will, and their clan chief is only a figure of sticks and rags. A wind whipped the cloth strips, emphasizing the hollowness of the shape, and then ridge and figure were gone. Egwene drew a deep breath. Of course. She had atoned for her lie, according to Ji'ito, by her own choice, and that meant it was as if the lie had never been spoken. She should have known better. But they had struck to the heart of her situation, as though they had been weeks in the Aes Sedai camp. Bear studied the floor, not wanting to witness her shame. Amys sat with chin in hand, sharp blue gaze trying to dig to her heart. "Some see me so." Another deep breath, and she pushed the truth out. "All but a handful do. Now, by the time we finish our battle, they will know I am their chief, and they will run as I say." "Return to us," Bear said. "You have too much honor for these women. Sorillia already has a dozen young men picked out for you to view in the sweat tents. She has a great desire to see you make a bridal wreath." "I hope she will be there when I wed Bear." To Gawain she hoped. That she would bond him she knew from interpreting her dreams, but only hope and the certainty of love said they would wed. "I hope all of you will, but I've made my choice." Bear would have argued further, and Melaine too, but Amys raised a hand and they fell silent, if not pleased. "There is much Ji in her decision. She will bend her enemies to her will, not run from them. I wish you well in your dance, Egwene al'Vir." She had been a maiden of the spear, and often thought as one still. "Sit, sit." "Her honor is her own," Bear said, frowning at Amys. "But I have another question." Her eyes were an almost watery blue, yet when they turned on Egwene, they were sharp as ever Amys's had been. "Will you bring these Aes Sedai to kneel to the Caracal?" Startled, Egwene nearly fell the last foot to the floor stones, rather than sitting. There was no hesitation in her answer, though. "I can't do that, Bear, and would not if I could. Our loyalty is to the Tower, to the Aes Sedai as a whole, above even the lands we were born in." That was true, or was supposed to be, though she wondered how the claim squared in their minds with her and the others' rebellion. Aes Sedai don't even swear fealty to the Amyrlin, and certainly not to any man. That would be like one of you kneeling to a clan chief. She made an illustration the way Melaine had, by concentrating on its reality. Tel'aran'rhiod was infinitely malleable. Beyond Kalandor, 3 wise ones dropped to their knees before a clan chief. The men strongly resembled Ruark, the women the 3 instinctors. She only held it for an instant, but Bear glanced at it and smirked loudly. The notion was preposterous. "Do not compare those women to us." Melaine's green eyes sparkled with something very like their old sharpness. Her tone was honed like a razor. Egwene held her tongue. The wise ones seemed to despise Aes Sedai, all except her. Or perhaps better to say they were teachers. She thought they might actually be them to Aes Sedai. Had been summoned by the hall to Shiriam and her circle of friends had met here regularly with these three, but that had ended as much because the wise ones refused to hide their contempt as because Egwene finally had been called. In Tel'aran'rhiod, a confrontation with someone more familiar with the place could be mortifying in the extreme. Even with Egwene, there was a distance now, and certain matters they...
Alright, everyone, gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone who keeps stopping by and chilling with me. Definitely appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.